Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us again on Seafood Matters. Today I'm joined by Magnus Johnston from the University of Hull and Duncan Boag from Macduff Ship Design. We're hearing more and more about fuel costs, efficiency, and decarbonisation. But for fishermen, this isn't theory, it's survival. There's an old saying in the industry, it all comes out the cod end. No matter what happens ashore, the cost lands with the man catching the fish. And when I hear all these discussions about price and cost, it always takes me back when I was a kid. And sometimes my mother used to say, whenever there was news of a fisherman or a boat lost at sea, she'd turn to us and say, "That's the price of fish." I think that's something everybody should always be mindful of. So, hi Duncan, and welcome to Seafood Matters, and hello again, Magnus. Welcome back.
Hi, Jim.
Great to see you both.
Hi.
Right, to start, Duncan, if I could ask, please tell us your background and also what about Macduff Ship Design?
So I'm a senior naval architect at Macduff Ship Design. I've been here for 14 years since I graduated from Strathclyde Uni in naval architecture. I always liked boats, and when I was trying to decide what to do for a job, I fell into naval architecture as an idea, and I've really enjoyed my career arc since then. Macduff Ship Design are a design company based in Macduff. We work closely with the shipyard here and have a common owner, but are also partly owned by the staff and work independently of them. So also designing and working with other shipyards to build across the rest of the UK and the rest of the world.
So you're not, that shows my ignorance already then. I thought you were part of the Macduff shipyard.
No, we're run as a separate company. We do a lot of the naval architecture work on the boats built in the shipyard, but we also work with a lot of other customers, whether that's owners or other yards, both in fishing but also wider, doing work in aquaculture and tugs and pilot boats and lots of other specialist small craft.
Okay, brilliant. No, it's a great, I know what a reputation they have for the boats that they build. It's fantastic. Magnus, where has your life taken you since our last recording?
I was thinking about this earlier, and it's probably appropriate to say to think about where I've come to where I am now from about the time when I met Duncan. And I met Duncan when I was going around the country talking to skippers about propulsion systems, about electrification, potential for electrification, and I really enjoyed chatting to Duncan because, as we'll find out as we go through, he's got a massive expertise in the sort of this area of propulsion systems on ships and lots of other things. After I'd done that, I got interested in trying to help fishermen find ways to save money and to save fuel, and that goes hand in hand with this idea of decarbonisation. And I think sometimes fishermen don't understand that they're part of this decarbonisation net zero drive when they're trying to save money. It's the same thing. It's absolutely the same thing. And so I started working on this thing that I call My Boat's Data, and it's a thing that records noises that from the engine and turns it into revs per minute and becomes a fuel use indicator, something we can talk about more as we go through. So I've been busy on that, and I've also set up a little community interest company in Bridlington on the end. Sorry, Jim, Brid, as you always insist I call it. So a little community interest company on the end of the pier in Brid, which is set up to try and help the fishing industry, help local fishermen and fishermen more broadly, doing research, getting involved in social science research, and just trying to help where I can, really. And so I'm looking forward next year to stepping down to 3 days a week at university and getting more involved in the activities down on the harbour, which is what I really enjoy.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, you're saying there you try to help. Well, I'm trying to help you, Magnus, because when I hear you saying bread, you sound like a local. So either of you, whatever you think is appropriate, are we looking at a short-term fuel cost squeeze, or has economics of the fishing fundamentally changed?
Shall I start, Duncan, and then
Yeah,
you
you
fill
go
in?
ahead.
Yeah. So, I think fuel prices are only ever going to go one way in the future and in the longer term. It's always going to be the diesel and petrol are going to get more expensive over time, and the industry kind of has to learn to deal with that somehow. And there are lots of things that fishing skippers can do to help reduce the impact of increasing fuel prices. But what we're seeing at the moment, it's the same as last time around with during COVID. The Ukrainian. The war with Ukraine, it's a sudden spike that's very difficult for fishermen to deal with. They've had no warning, and all of a sudden, I think prices have gone back up to where they were at their peak. I mean, sort of back up to over £1 a litre from 60p. At least that's what I think. Duncan, you might know better than me.
I mean, I'm not certain on exact pricing, but I think, as you say, we're at this steep point of a spike in the price, and that will come down. But I'd agree that the longer term diesel's only going to become more expensive and harder to come by as we see the world transition away from fossil fuel use. And that might lead to some bits where there's the opposite of now, where there's oversupply, as other industries have moved off of fossil fuel quicker than expected. But I think in general, it's only going to keep going in this direction.
Duncan, when you're saying that, or to both of you, I've done a recent podcast with Jason Monroe from Ecomotus, and that very question, I asked them about, for the bigger boats, things like the electrification and all the different things that technology that's been looked at, and I said, is it realistic to think that's possible? And he says, for now, absolutely not. He says it's diesel, and for now, well into the foreseeable future. Is that something you agree with?
So I've done a number of studies with fisheries innovation and sustainability into what a net zero fishing boat looks like, and basically the bigger the boat is, the more intense its power use is, the more difficult that transition becomes. There are options, and we could build the boats to suit those options. They would be more expensive to build, and they would be larger for the same fishing capacity. But it's all something that's technically possible to do in the next 5 or 10 years with the way the industry is developing. But what's lagging a long way behind that is the shoreside infrastructure and the petrochemical plants to develop those fuel, and any indication of what those fuels will actually cost to the fishermen going to sea to make investment decisions in what they do. I was listening to a recent webinar on future fuels saying that for shipping to go entirely net zero, renewing the entire fleet of ships in the world is only 25% of the cost. The other 75 is on the energy generation and petrochemical work to make the fuel, and the delivery to the vessels and all of the infrastructure that requires. And that really shocked me how small a part of changing the marine industry changing the boats is.
I think one of the things I've learned from talking to Duncan over the time, and from my own sort of investigation, I mean, I was looking particularly at electrification when I was talking to skippers, but there isn't a silver bullet here. There's no single solution. And so if you looked at Brid, for example, these are all potters. and the inshore guys could transition to electric if the infrastructure in the port was there. But it's not just the port, it's upstream from the port as well. The infrastructure needs to be in place to support electrification in Brid. But if you go up to Fraser or Peterhead, where you're looking at big trawling fleets, it's a different solution. And I mean, Duncan can talk more to that than I can, but different ports are going, and different fleets are going to have different solutions when it comes to their power.
Probably fishermen face rising costs, but don't get paid any more for their catch. And really, is that sustainable in any industry?
Well, I would say here, it's partly driven by fishermen becoming more efficient and landing more. So I spoke to a fisherman off the west coast of Ireland who lived all his life on Arran, on the Irish Arran, Enda Keneally he's called, and he was talking about he's about our age, not Duncan's age, our age, Jim, and he remembers people making a living out of 50 pots, and they could make a living out of 50 pots because I guess they got paid more and they didn't have the same level of expenditure or lifestyle expectations that people have nowadays. And as the fleets have become more efficient, they've landed more. And as they've landed more, I think the price must have gone down, in relation to, I guess, lifestyles. So some prices. Last time I looked at this, I was looking at a paper, and the prices for some fish have not gone up in 20 years. They've remained the same, partly because of this increased efficiency of fishermen. I mean, you think about the trawlers that are working the North Sea mackerel fleets and all the rest of the big boats that are out there. I mean, they're much more efficient than any of the older boats were. And there are a lot of solutions that hopefully we'll talk about tonight, but one of them might be, and I'm sure the industry is well aware of this and will be trying to do this, is fish smarter. Try and catch things at the right time of year when they're worth more money, and try and get the right size. I mean, I'm sure the industry already does this, but where it's possible to be a bit cleverer about what they land. Maybe there's things they can do there. I don't think there's an easy solution though. Yeah.
When you're talking about pots, Magnus, it always takes me back. When my father was fishing, I'm talking about the 50s into early 60s, they were a sea netter. So they would partly sea net certain times of the year, and then there would be we call them creels, you call them pots down there. And they made a good living. And now when you think of it, I don't know about your area, Holderness, but up here, some of the bigger crabbers, their pots are in the thousands, number of thousand. And they're single and two-man boats with 700 and 800 or up to 1,000. Now, that was a 54-foot wooden boat, which I thought was, in my younger days, I thought she was a battleship. And there were 5 of a crew, so that's 5 of a crew to get wages. The most creels they ever had out was 100. Mm. Now, the man very well, Hans, uncle, he was fishing 65. He's now fishing 45. And I think that I often wonder to myself, looking back at my father's time, thinking of Hans and that, and partly what you're saying as well about fishing clever and that, Magnus, but I just wonder if there could be work done to get the balance on the market. There'll be a point on the market when the price will go up. So if they were to not just fish clever, but sell clever, and just keep the market to a point where the price is not coming down, so you could work less pots and get a better price. it's win-win all the way.
But this is your area of expertise. It's what you did as a career, wasn't it? You were a fish merchant. So,
Yeah,
but how global was the market when you
that's
were, and I wonder whether part of the problem is now that, you can catch crabs in Bridlington, and they can be in China
yeah,
or Japan or Vietnam 48 hours later, and so the price isn't driven by local markets. It's driven by geopolitics as much as anything, and I think that's an issue. That's part of the issue. That's driven this need. So fishermen need to be. If you look at a fast worker in Brid, and they're doing 3, 4, 5, 600 pots, in order to get round their pots quickly, it needs to have a big engine. It's virtually a speedboat. Some of these things,
yeah.
and then that's not the fault of the fishermen. They've kind of been forced into that by competition amongst themselves and a global market where prices may not have risen the way they should have done. Well, costs seem to rise,
Yeah. Well, in a recent podcast with the guy Greg Mercer in the Marine States in East Canada, he goes on to say about how their biggest market used to be America. It's now China. They're paying more.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's probably underlines what you're saying. Yeah. If fuel keeps rising and incomes stay flat, where does the adjustment happen? Is it fewer boats, fewer trips, or people leaving the industry altogether?
Duncan?
I mean, to an extent, that's a little outside my area of expertise, but certainly we need to find a way to get that more level, so as we have a sustainable industry. And to some extent, the sustainable industry may be fewer boats or maybe fewer trips, trying to find a way to maximize the value of your catch against what you've spent in fuel is going to be really essential when there's spikes in fuel price.
I think there may be changes. Well, we are already seeing modifications to gear, like lighter trawls that don't require as much fuel in order for, to maximize catch for less cost. And the stuff they're doing in Harriet Watt, where they're looking at, Paul Fernandez is trying to develop a trawl has developed a trawl that's more selective and only takes out, is selective in the water. It's like I think he's using AI or something. But these sorts of things may help. But I can see, as has already happened for other reasons, there's been a drive towards more static gear around the coast of the UK and off the coast of America, for a whole lot of reasons that are nothing to do with fuel. They're to do with management, policy, and all the rest of it. But I can see the fishermen that are fishing with static gear that doesn't need to be dragged through the water might be at an advantage compared to trawlers. And so we might see fishermen re-adopting some of those static gear methods from days gone by, maybe fixed engines on the shore, maybe if they can, sort of static nets, more people using nets where they can. I think there's a myriad of different things. All the things you mentioned that are impacting on fishermen, but there's a lot of responses they can make in order to try and do something about that. But I wish there was a kind of easy solution, but I don't think there's any one.
Yeah. Do you think that's anything to do with the pressure from environmental groups where they're talking about impact on the seabed?
I guess there's some, so they certainly have a top hit list of types of fishing they don't like. I mean, they don't like scallop dredgers. They don't like benthic trawls, and sometimes it feels like they're just working their way down the list, and they'll get to pots and static nets eventually, and start having a go there,
Yeah.
And my view is that the best thing that fishing can do is to have a broad footstep and tread lightly, by which I mean they have a diversity of fishing methods by boat and by port, and that where possible they're not constrained into fishing for using one kind of gear the whole time, and that would let them take opportunities where they can and maybe not have to travel so far in order to find those opportunities. And that's something that the price of fuel is going to impact on.
And do you think their fishermen are forced into a position where they have to fish harder to even stand still?
I think certainly if the price drops of what they're catching, they have to fish harder in order to break even. And and I guess the other end of that is if you get a good price, you'll fish harder in order to make. They're businessmen. I mean, it's not a charity. You know, these guys
Yeah.
are. They need to make a living, and that's something we need to respect and remember. Yeah. So
Definitely. I mean, it appears all risk sits with the fishermen, while others in the supply chain have more control over their margins. The fishermen have none.
I was wondering about that. Because what about fish merchants, Jim? There's no risk in being a fish merchant.
Well, they have a more chance of increasing getting the price up, asking for more money. Whereas fishermen are putting them on the auction and take what they get. They have to.
Yeah. Maybe there's a need to change there. Maybe there's a need for a higher diversity of ways for fishermen to sell. I mean, maybe we can learn from COVID a bit, where there was quite a few fishermen went to the effort of selling direct to the public, and they were able to make a bit more out of that.
Yeah.
Although talking to Carl and Jenny Price in Bridlington, you know, the paperwork involved in that for a small fishing operation nowadays is horrendous. You know, so it's a barrier to that kind of thing.
I was involved in a contract with 3 trawlers and a processor and a supermarket, Marks and Spencer's, and that was going back into the 80s. So it's no rocket science that it hasn't been done before. The fishermen liked it because it would give them a bit of stability as they were catching. They could work out what their hauls were worth. I think we should be looking more at the selling the shore side. I definitely feel that. And I feel there should be more conversation between the different sectors. I even feel when they're talking about quota negotiations or any of that negotiations, I think shore base, they should be in the room. And the scientists and the fishermen, I think they should all be in the room together.
Yeah, I wonder if that's been something that's been missing in the past, and the shore base doesn't get the attention that the ocean-going part of the industry gets. You know, that we don't hear enough from they're like two separate worlds. You've got the processing sector and you've got the catching sector, you know, and yes, I think you're right, Jim. Maybe it's the job of Seafish is to try and bring those guys together.
Yeah. I mean, there's a situation I had, it's last year, I think, or not that long ago. I got fish from a friend in Scrabster. He says, help yourself. So I took a few haddock in a bag. He turned to me and he says, don't take that rubbish. He says, there's better fish on the market here. I said, I'm happy with this. Leave it. So home I goes. I filleted them. Now, and when I'm filleting them, I'm looking back and thinking to myself, I was involved in retail because I had counters in some supermarkets, fresh counters, and we also had a actual fish shop. And in the old weights, and that 4-ounce fillet was a perfect size for the fishmonger. A housewife would come in for their family. 4 fillets would be the pound in weight. And I was filleting this fish. So that was prime size for the retail trade, which was a good market for fishermen to get the retail trade. So I took the wee kitchen scales out, weighed them, from 4.5 to 5.5 ounce. And here's me thinking, gee, back in the days, that would have been prime size and quality, obviously, for the retail trade. Do you know where that fish came from, guys? Bait box.
Crikey.
And I've been asking some of the merchants and people, and all I hear from them is, oh, what the market wants. The market wants bigger fish. I would say, oh, I see. So the market wants to pay £25 a kilo instead of 15. Is that it? And I think that needs a serious look. And that's one of the things, Magnus, going back, that's one of the things I feel, if they're sitting together in the room, that can be discussed and spoken about.
Yeah.
Because they're catching them now, so they could get a more value for them. So I think they've a long way to go.
Yeah, there's a need for more collaboration, isn't there? But it's competitive, isn't it? You know, so in Bridlington, there's 4 merchants, and they're all trying to get the maximum catch for the minimum price. That's because they're a business, you know. And the fishermen are trying to, you know, they're trying to make there's all sorts of complexities there, you know.
But it's a very short-sighted way of looking at it, because any of that fish merchants, if they get them too cheap for too long, they're not going to get any more. There's not going to be left.
Well, I think one of the things that's happened in the past, and hopefully it's changing now, is the way that fishermen would get home when come into port, and they'd have a load of fish, and all the fishermen want to do is go home, and so they just throw the catch ashore, you know, and they wouldn't worry too much about what the quality was, and then they'd just go home, you know. I think hopefully that's not the case anymore, but maybe there's something to do with getting merchants to value good quality product at the quayside, rather than, I don't know, maybe they feel they've got to buy whatever's there just and pass it on, you know, rather than encouraging their clients, I guess, to get their fishermen or who they're buying from to bring the best quality in. I mean, do you think in fish markets, do you see better prices for better quality crab and for better quality nephrops and you know?
You don't see them in the market.
All right, of course. Well, there you go. So nephrops, goes straight into straight ashore.
Yeah. So there is, you know, there is in a modern society, technology, the way that there must be a way. From a policy and science perspective, is that understood well enough, do you think?
I think it's complicated. That's the problem. It's everything. There's a sort of, at a local level, you know, there should be a relationship between what's coming out of the cod end, how much there is, what quality is, and the price that you get for it. But then there's all these other factors now, like we were talking about earlier, globalization, and the fact that you can sell your fish anywhere, you know, in the world. That's impacting on it as well. So there's all these other factors that impact on price. It's not just supply and demand, and I don't know how we get hold of that. That's not an area I feel confident to talk about. You know,
Duncan, from a vessel design side, can you realistically ease the pressure, or does it always come back to the catch value?
So it's a balance of the two. There's a lot of things that we could actively do, and we do actively do when we're designing new boats to try and reduce the fuel burden on them, to make them better in the sea, to both make them more comfortable, better platforms to fish from, and also use less fuel. But everything's always a compromise to suit what needs to go on the boat and to meet regulations. And it's sort of almost always going to be the biggest factor in whether a boat makes profit, or how much profit they make is how much they get for the catch.
Yeah. When you look at the current fleet, how much of it is simply not suited for today's fuel costs?
So the fleet that we have in the UK is very diverse, as we've already talked about. Lots of different types of fishing operation in lots of areas. Um, some of those boats are very efficient boats, operating really well to their capacity within in the fuel. Some of them are older boats with older equipment, older engines, and while the operators can do as much as they can with them, they are going to struggle to remain competitive because they simply won't catch the same volume of fish for the amount of fuel they use.
If a skipper came to you tomorrow struggling with fuel bills, what practical changes could you recommend?
I've got a nice big list of things here that I've organised for this.
What a surprise! What a surprise!
And something I prepared earlier.
Yeah, and I think the key thing on this list is that they all have positives, but they all have negatives. There's a good chance a lot of skippers are already doing quite a lot of the things on this list to try and manage their fuel bill, and understanding the positive and the negative, and balancing them out to make the right decision for their businesses, for their fishing vessel is the important thing. Sort of categorized them into a couple of bits. I've got some behavioral changes here. One thing that it was a propeller manufacturer said to me is having a fuel flow meter sitting within sight of the skipper while they're driving the boat can be a huge driver in reducing the amount of fuel you use. There can often be just the slightest tweak on the throttle can leave the boat going at best part of the same speed, towing the same gear, but can maybe knock 1 or 2% out of your fuel use. And that accumulated over the trip can make a big difference when we're in a very tight margin space.
Can I interrupt there, Duncan, before you carry on down your list? Because it matches well with the My Boats data thing that I've been trying to develop. And talking to, it was a Glaswegian ship's architect whose name escapes me right at this moment in time. But he had done this study on a barge on aquaculture, on an operation. And they'd found that just the threat of putting in a fuel meter and something that monitored the behaviour of the boat saved 15% of the fuel bill. And when I came away from that, and Mallinson's it was, I think, is that a Glasgow ship's architect?
Oh, yeah.
Engineer, yeah. So and I came away from that, and I went and did some digging and looked at other areas like truck drivers and cars and all the rest of it. And it seems to be a fairly standard figure between 10 and 15% fuel savings just by having a fuel monitor or a miles per gallon monitor in your face, so you're seeing it all the time, and that's what we're trying to develop, something that will work on any boat. So I don't think it's just about, and I think the behavioural stuff, Duncan, you might have more there that's worth talking about, but
Yeah.
To me, we don't really know what behaviours will help improve fuel use. We know that backing off the engine a bit. I mean, every skipper I've spoken to said about 70%, Duncan, of the engine speed is kind of generally where it's most efficient. But there'll be other things they could do, like choosing the weather they work in, choosing how far they go, all that kind of stuff. So sorry, Duncan, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it fits well with the.
No.
I'm sorry, Duncan, but I'm going to interrupt now because Magnus, when you're saying that about the meter in front of you, it's reminding me of a caption I saw today on social media, and there's two shots, one above the other, and it's the difference between COVID, the lockdown, and now. And here's this guy, picture the scene, he's standing filling his truck, and during COVID, he's got a mask over his face. He's now got a mask over his eyes. He doesn't want to see them.
Yeah, I can believe that.
Sorry, Duncan. Carry on.
No, that's fine. Yeah, the fuel flow meter is almost more a tool that you can use to see if your behavioural changes make a difference. What I was going to say is slowing down and speed management is something that can make a huge difference in terms of fuel use. As you say, having an engine at about 70% is typically considered to be very efficient for the engine, but you've got to play that against maybe having the engine slightly less efficient, but using a lot less fuel to go slower could be advantageous. Vessel speed has like a cubic relationship with your power consumption, pretty much. So, if you double your speed, you use 8 times as much fuel. So I don't think we're talking about halving your speed, but there's a very fine limit where you can still travel at a good speed to your grounds and doing your fishing, but a small amount of knockoff can have a big effect on your fuel. But obviously, you want to get your product to the market quickly. You don't want people on the boat for an unnecessary amount of time. So there is a trade-off in terms of doing that. I've got here turning engines off when they're not in use. I'm very prone to seeing boats outside in the harbour here, and they're tied up alongside, and they've still got the engine running well after when they're tied up. And all I'm thinking about is all that money that they're putting up the stack. And obviously, you've got to have it on for some things, but things
Duncan, if I could
make a big
just,
difference quickly. Yeah, jump in.
sorry, Duncan, I just want to ask when you're saying that a bit, that's staggering that you double the speed and you're 8 times more fuel. That's unbelievable. But I'm just wondering, obviously, up our way, Pentland Firth and that notorious, have the fishermen got the choice? Because when you think of the tides and weather conditions and that, that must have a factor. So would they always have the? I don't know. You know better. I'm just asking.
Well, you don't always have the choice, and that's where this is a balanced view, and it's where you can, if you can slow down, you'll use less fuel. Where you can't, then your operation is the most important thing. And I don't want to be the person to tell a fisherman how to do their job. They know their boat and they know their operation better than me. All I'm trying to give them is advice that if you're transiting slower, it is going to save fuel. And it is one of the things that I have on my list of behavioural possibilities is when you're heading out into areas with weather and tides and tidal flows, it's trying to time your operation so as you're using those factors instead of them working against you. If you're going through the Pentland Firth, you don't want to be doing that against the tide. You want to be having that nice flow to take you through it. And that's going to save you fuel significantly compared to going against the tide. But
Duncan,
again,
do you know what
that's not possible. So
do you know what the difference in fuel usage is between a flat cam day and say punching into a decent sea? Have you got any idea at all what that might mean?
So that is probably the hardest factor to determine when we're designing a boat, because the boat design makes a huge difference. And very often what you'll find is boats that are really driven towards being efficient on a flat cam day can be very poor for fuel in any sort of weather. We see that with I was speaking to someone who operates on one of these offshore cruise supply boats for the wind farm industry. Slightly dirty word to talk about on a fishing podcast. But, and he was saying that these boats, they'll cruise out at high speed perfectly until you've got a foot of chop. And at a foot of chop, the thing slams, and they've got to come basically back to a quarter of the speed they go at otherwise you just can't drive the boat. So it's very difficult to give a figure, because for them it's a very high, but for a lot of the trawlers that we've been working on recently, that's the most important thing, is that it has good propulsive efficiency in a big sea, that it doesn't get affected by that. So maybe on a flat cam day there's a more efficient boat than it, but in the environment that it's in, it retains its best efficiency.
Can you use the motion generated from, if you're in a big sea, can you use that as in hull design to become more efficient? Because there's a lot of weight that's been moved up and down by the sea. Has anybody tried that, or is that beyond the realms of fantasy?
That's not something I've heard of. You better get a patent on it, Magnus.
Don't worry, Duncan. Magnus is not trying to catch you out. He's just trying to work it out for his catamaran in the Humber yesterday.
Well, so that was a really good example, Duncan. So as Duncan was saying, this is a boat designed really well for the Humber. Really shallow draft, twin hull, big engines on the back. So it's used mostly by anglers. And on a flat cam day, it's the best boat in the world. But we had a wind coming from the west yesterday. It was coming straight down the Humber, and it made a chop of about just over a meter, a meter and a half maybe. And it's about a 10 meter catamaran, and it was doing exactly what you're saying, Duncan. When you going into the sea, you could feel it when we hit a wave. It almost stopped the boat, and that cannot be efficient. That must be, and those are the sort of things you need to think about. I mean, I could tell if I'd been on a monohull. I like the movement of a monohull going into the sea if it's not going too fast. You get that. There's a nice, it's comfortable, but it wasn't comfortable yesterday.
Yeah, that's one of the most interesting bits about my job, is trying to dig down into what the skippers that we're designing the boats for are going to do with them, and how to optimize for their operational profile to make sure they've got the right boat. Mm-hmm. And the nature of that is, if they say they are going to be doing everything, you end up with a jack of all trades. If it's someone who's fishing out of Shetland with going out all states, you've got something that's really designed for battling through heavy seas. Or if it's like you're talking about, something on the Humber, it's just not designed for any waves. And when you get that, it's not optimum, but that's 5% of its life rather than the 95, and you've just got to take that as the compromise that's been best for their operation.
Duncan, what you're saying there is bringing something back into my mind, and it'd be interesting your view on it, and is it still relevant and still used? And I have to put my hand up and say I wasn't aware of this, but during my career and being in different places in Iceland, then did a lot of business in the Faroes. Now, we were at a shipyard, and then back here, so I'm pulling all this together. It's over a period. The Fisheries Museum here in Wick, it's a fantastic place, and they had an old, what's called a stroma yawl. Stroma being the island in the Pentland Firth, and a yawl being a small boat. Now, a stroma yawl would maybe be just less than 10 meters, well, much less than 10 meters, but they would class it as a 5-man, and 5 men could sit beside each other, the beam. It'd be a beamier boat. But the guys in the Faroe were talking about a much narrower boat. And Iceland was different. And all the hulls were a different shape. I didn't know about it, and I found it very interesting. But they were saying that was because the different sea in that different areas. Is that does that that'll be
Yeah,
is that
that makes a lot of sense to me.
okay? Okay,
When you've got sort of potentially quite tall but short waves, something narrower is good for that because it'll sort of go straight up and down. Where something that's beamier, if it ends upside on, will roll in and out of it more as it gets caught by the wave taking it up. Um, but obviously, the beam gives you some level of stability, so it's important. So the balance of those two factors really dictates how you design your boat, and I could see that there would be a big diversion in different areas to suit what sort of waves they encountered and how stable they liked their boats to feel.
that's fascinating. Yeah, and would that come into your work now when you're talking about sort of efficiencies? Would the shape of the hull and that come into that
Yeah. The shape
equation?
of the hull is one of the most important things. In general, we'll try and keep boats as fine a shape as possible, and try and keep their beam relatively narrow if we can. Um, the problem becomes with more and more fishing gear on board, especially when it's positioned higher and higher on the boat. You need the beam to give us more stability to take that weight. And as the boats catch more and they are limited in their length, the shape becomes less fine and becomes fuller. So it's all a compromise. Compromise is the biggest word whenever we're designing a boat. You've got to find the right balance to suit what the owner wants and what ticks most of the boxes that they need.
I guess
That
that's why potters have become like brick shaped because they need that deck space to hold all a string of pots, and strings of pots now are what 30, 40 big pots, so that affects the design as well, and they need to be able to move the gear around.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they look under the water, whether they are still quite streamlined and then quite boxy on top, or whether they've got boxy the whole way through. I haven't had a good look at some of the potters down in your direction. I'll need to next time I'm in the area.
They'll probably take offence if we call them boxy. I'll get told off next time I'm in Brid.
Duncan, you wouldn't have thought about it yourself, but I know Magnus was watching me closely. I mentioned Iceland, Faroe, Strom, all that islands. I didn't mention Greenland. Are we talking about small efficiency gains, or does the fleet need just a complete rethink?
Um, so there's a lot of small changes that we can make that are relatively cheap or easy to do, and then there's some larger changes we can do that are more expensive. One of the things that I always think of when you're talking about small efficiency gains is I don't know if you've ever heard of marginal gains, a sort of term coined by British cycling as they tried to take over the Olympics and win all the gold medals, which was that they looked at every factor that they could, the chains on the bikes, the wheels, the handlebars, the beds the people were sleeping in, taking outside air conditioning. And they thought all of those things would give them 1 to 2%. But when you bring it all together, it gave Team GB a huge competitive advantage. And to an extent, I think we need to be looking at that, taking every marginal gain that we can in terms of fuel efficiency and take all the small gains, and that can make a big difference. I do think in the longer term, in the transition away from fossil fuels, there is going to be a big rethink about what type of vessels and what balance of vessels we need. But at the moment, it's very difficult to see that as there's no real clear path in terms of which fuels will be available and the pricing for anyone to run a real economical model of it.
Yeah.
And just circling back on my list of other practical changes that I can recommend. I'd sort of talked about behavioural stuff. There's also things that can be done on the vessel, from as simple as keeping the bottom clean and the props clean to looking at anti-fouling that can keep it clean for longer. Some of them also talk about having better surface friction ratios. I'm never certain about those claims and how well they stack up. I know you were speaking recently to some people about propeller coatings. I think did I listen to one with David Stevens, who's had that on the Crystal Sea propeller coating, claiming that makes a big difference. We've obviously got the Ecomotus system that you can have to improve your engine efficiency. There's a lot of warnings that go alongside that in terms of the engine manufacturers don't like it. And I have a certain degree of concern around having hydrogen in the engine room. Obviously, the way that it's installed is MCA certified and I'm sure is well considered, but it's one of those things that just always makes me nervous with that product. Otherwise, I think it's a very good idea. And then you probably get into the more expensive things that I'm thinking about here. There's the potential that new engines could make a big difference to a boat, and that might be a new engine that's smaller to suit going at a slightly slower speed and keeping it in its economical range. But it could also be that the engine on board a boat is undersized and it needs to be a bigger engine. Newer, more modern engines are more fuel efficient than the previous generations. So there is a big potential for that. But it's a big ticket item. It costs a lot of money. And also, I know a lot of guys like sort of old Gardner engines because they're quite bulletproof and they can do a lot of work on them themselves. Whereas if you get a modern engine that's got an electronic controller, if you have a problem, you're sort of calling in service agents a lot of the time. Thinking about the propellers on the boat and the nozzles, if that's something on it, whether there's a better way of pitching the propellers to suit the operation better. I've also seen energy recovery systems on the boat. So you've got a lot of heat that goes up your exhaust. There are people who develop systems, and we've seen one on a fishing boat we designed that uses that heat to run a desalination plant. So that puts fresh water on the boat that's then used for their ice making. And the fresh water is made straight out of the heat that would otherwise be waste. I've seen systems that do a similar principle, but they can turn it into electricity. And then the sort of even further in the cost bracket is looking at some hybrid systems or even a full electric boat. A full electric boat like Hands that we talked about earlier, you become decoupled from the price of diesel. To an extent, you're still caught up in oil price because the electric grid is still very fluctuating with oil price. But as we move away from fossil fuels, that would become a much more stable in terms of your fixed costs. Hybrid systems for some boats could make a huge difference in efficiency, but for others make no difference. So it's very much dependent on the vessel. And then there's other things we could do that are changes to the boat, whether that's lengthening it or cutting out the bow and putting a new, more efficient bow on, or a stern, or adding a nozzle if you're towing gear can make a big difference. Or if you're not towing gear and your boat has a nozzle, then taking the nozzle off could be a big advantage. I realise that's quite a long list of ideas for changes, and as I say, not all will be applicable to every boat, but it's something for people to think about as ways that you could invest money to save money. And that's going to be the difficult bit, is understanding it at what point you've actually saved your money.
That last point's really interesting, and I don't know, what does the nozzle do, and why is it better on a trawler and not better on a potter, for example?
So the nozzle basically circles up the propeller, and it helps it to pull water through. So when you're traveling at slow speeds, it allows you to produce more force to push the boat forward. And that's really good when you're towing gear, because you're worried about how much force you can produce to pull. When you're operating static gear, you're not that worried about what you can pull behind you. You're more worried about being efficient at sort of close to the vessel's hull speed. And at that point, the nozzle's really dragging in the water and creating more resistance than the additional force that it provides for you.
That's interesting. There's another thing. So something that was suggested to me by a fisherman a couple of years ago, around about the time when we were seeing each other regularly, Duncan, for the FIS stuff. And that was the idea of carrying a small engine on the boat, especially for potters, for when you're just nudging the boat around your gear, and that came up against the MCA, or maybe it was fishing regulations, because it would be power that counted towards the power they would, the way that boats are licensed is about the power of the engine, isn't it? So, I mean,
Yeah.
does that would it make
some,
sense?
I mean, that would be some extra kilowatts, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
In the water, not that they'd be using them at the same time.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, you see it actually on a lot of sort of small leisure fishing boats, especially in America. I'm thinking about these bass boats. They've got a big outboard on the back to blast about the lake at high speed, and then they've got just a little engine to sort of creep along the margins of the loch that they're fishing on. And I could certainly see something like that, just to keep you moving forward along your static gear as you're picking it up, being really helpful, because it would let you be, either out of gear with the main engine in neutral, which is still burning some, or turning it off entirely.
Duncan, you mentioned there, and you're right. I have done recent podcasts. I recorded with companies Ecomotus and Assured Marine. Ecomotus, as you said, they're got the hydrogen, and you were saying you're not very comfortable with it. I was telling a fisherman there recently, when after that, recommending he wants to listen to it, and he was a bit concerned. But the reason he was concerned, I got the word wrong. I didn't say it was hydrogen. I told him it was nitrogen.
Oops.
But they offer. Sorry.
Just to come in on that, when I say I'm concerned, hydrogen is a gas that has a serious explosion risk. But I understand that the Ecomotus system uses a very small amount of it. I haven't seen it installed, and I don't know what they do in terms of mitigating that explosion risk. And I would want to, before I could put my full weight as a professional naval architect behind saying it's a good idea, if you're going to install it on your boat, you need to understand that that's a risk.
Yeah.
And mitigation to make sure it's not a risk that's going to happen.
Well, they say they're RENA approved, but I'm not sure about RENA. But also, as you said, the MCA have approved it, and some other body as well, funding body. So it seems to be, I'm not pushing it, but it certainly seems to have not
Yeah,
concerned
and
people
and
too
as I
much.
say, the chemistry behind what they say it does makes really good sense. Effectively, it's adding a small amount of hydrogen into the fuel mix, and it makes the diesel burn more efficiently. And that I totally believe. And at the moment, we can see engine manufacturers making dual fuel engines. And one of the big things that they say is when you run a dual fuel, so that's diesel and another fuel, when you run one of those as a diesel and hydrogen, you don't need a lot of hydrogen in the mix to really improve the diesel. So what they are saying they can do is, I would say, very legitimate, and certainly um, David on the Crystal Sea is very positive about it. Um, as I say, my area of concern is just around how that hydrogen's handled and how you ensure the safety in the engine room. And then also, people need to understand if they've got an engine that's under warranty, if they put that on it, the engine manufacturer won't stand by the warranty because you put something in that makes the bit inside the engine bang just a little bit harder.
The guys, both David and the guy Mike Ballinger, when they're talking about the coating on the prop, they're saying it's unbelievable the difference. They reckon there's less noise, there's more maneuverability, they get a better towing speed, and you'll know more about this than me, that's for sure. But what the part that really surprised me was they were saying this was Mark and Simon from Assured Marine. They reckoned it was more important having that coating on the prop than the hull. Now, my head is thinking, when you think of the surface area of the hull, but they reckoned it was more important on the prop than the hull. And David Stephen reckons 25-meter boat, he says, the last 3 years he's saved something like 230, well, the figure he mentions, 235,000. That's serious money.
Yeah, and knowing David just a little bit, it's going to be a mixture of the things he's talked about, but he's going to be very careful in the way that he drives his boat. He's going to be doing everything he can to make it fuel efficient. That's what he's really set his mind to, and when he sets his mind to something, he tends to do it very well. So that's a sort of saving that you can make by making changes like this. But there's obviously for both the Ecomotus and the propeller coating, there will be a cost to go along with it. The surface friction on a propeller is very, very important to its efficiency. And any drop off in propulsive efficiency of the propeller is effectively just lost fuel. It's money wasted. So if that coating does as they're saying and keeps that at the right surface friction, surface finish to get the maximum efficiency out of the propeller, I can well believe that it would make a good saving to the boat. The propellers are turning; they're a really active part of the boat. So although they've got a lot less surface area, they have a big impact on what you're doing. One of the other things in this playoff is because it's got a relatively small surface area, the cost of putting the special polymer coating on it is going to be relatively smaller because you'll just need less coating. Where if you do the hull, it's going to be a big expense comparatively. And the surface smoothness of a hull does play a factor in resistance, but it's by no means the biggest factor. The whole shape of the boat pushing through the water is a lot more than the specific surface friction in general.
Yeah. From what you've seen, obviously, do these sort of solutions actually make a difference in practice for working fishermen, or are they more long-term incremental improvement?
So a system like the Ecomotus or the propeller coating or some of the other things I talked about in the list I had of changes you could make to the vessel, there'll be a relatively instant change. It's the boat is different at that point. It will burn less fuel from that point on for doing your operation. The problem is you've got to pay for that upfront, and it's going to take you time that the fuel saving adds up to what that upfront cost is. And I mean, that's really how I think it's best to look at these modifications is in terms of a payback time. If I spend this much and it takes me a year to pay it back, that might be good. If it takes 10 years, it's maybe not worth it. If it takes a week, it's a no-brainer. You've just got to do it. And that the ones that are the shortest period of the time are the ones that are best to invest your money in first. But I would recommend caution and just listening to what the salesmen of a company say their product will do for your efficiency. If you listen to Magnus, his my boat state is going to save you 15%, but that's maybe only if you're not operating your boat very efficiently at the moment. And everything's different depending on how you operate your boat. So what a salesman says is always to be taken with a pinch, or maybe a bigger than
Shovelful.
a pinch of salt.
Shovelful of salt.
Yeah.
I think that's a really important point there, Duncan, that it's about skippers being aware and having it in their face the whole time. You can save money, and you can save money by the actions that you're taking. And those are like that list. I'm sure you've got a longer list hidden away somewhere that's top secret for Macduff Shipyard. But it's sort of all those things you can do. And it goes in all the way from simple behaviours like switching your engine off when you're alongside, knocking back on the revs a little bit, making sure you've got the bottom clean. All those things people can do tomorrow, can't they? And they will make, every one of those will make a little bit of a difference. But you've got to have, I mean, I would have a sign up in the wheelhouse saying, how can I save money today, in how I behave.
I mean, I certainly notice when I'm driving, sometimes I can be in the mood to drive really efficiently, and I'll put the miles per gallon on, and I'll be really good. And then sometimes I'm more interested in about where I'm going and getting there, and there's a huge difference. And I think trying to keep on task on, the least fuel you burn when you're out fishing, the more profit you make from selling your fish. And the more that can be what you're thinking about, what dictates the decisions you make as you are driving and making, helming probably is the right word, and making the decisions on board is really important.
There's always talk of the next generation vessel, Duncan, but is that realistic for working fishermen just now?
There's a lot to be said for what the next generation of fishing boats will look like. Since I've started here, we've had a relative change in terms of what we've designed. It's been a lot of work and tank testing to improve the boats. But largely they're all very similar, and they're a small improvement on what was before. When we start looking forward to the next generation, that's going to be as fossil fuels phase out, and the boats are going to have to be quite different to suit that. And for some vessels, that is a massive opportunity. Inshore vessels that have relatively low power demands, being able to go to electric systems that really free them up from that oil price could be a huge advantage to them. All you have to do is listen to Hans talk about his boat, and you're convinced it's a great idea. But at the other side of the scale, for the stuff that's very power intensive and fuel intensive, we're at a real crossroads where when diesel stops working, what that next generation looks like is difficult to think.
Okay. Magnus, do policymakers fully understand that fishermen can't just pass rising costs on?
Sometimes. Yes, I think one of the problems we have is that this is a long-term problem. This isn't something that's got a 5-year timescale around it. It's a 15, 20, 30-year issue. And politicians come and go. Policymakers come and go. Every time you talk to DEFRA, the person who you were talking to last time has moved on and they're doing something else because they're bright young things. They're moving on to another department and changing their career. And that life, the number of people who stay in fisheries at the level where they're making decisions, I wonder how often they stay for more than 5 years or 10 years or something like that. And I think that's a difficulty that we face with. It's not just in fishing, in other areas of policy as well. You see it in wind farms. You're dealing with wind farm operators. The liaison people that you're dealing with change regularly, and you've got to educate them all over again. And you'll hear fishermen or fishermen's representatives say exactly the same thing. Every time there's a change in government or a change in minister or a change in the rep at DEFRA, they have to be re-educated to understand the fishing industry and understand that when they make a policy decision that requires fishermen to change their gear or their engines or something about their boat or legislation or, the MCA come in with lots of rules and regulations about stability or all these other. I mean, Duncan's an expert on stability, by the way. You might want to talk to him about that. But they, every time they come in with a new regulation, health checks, all that kind of stuff, it has a cost, and I don't think people always that make decisions always recognize these things, or maybe they recognize them but don't recognize the severity of these things. And something that means a 5% increase in costs for a fisherman at the bottom end of the scale, a little boat who does the job because that's what he or she wants to do, not because they're out to make £1 million. They can be quite strongly impacted by minor changes in the gear that they're allowed to use, or all sorts of things that can impact them. So yeah, we need to keep educating people in power, that make the decisions. That's where the NFFO and the SFF and the Scottish Whitefish Producers Association all come in, as they're such important organisations because they are trying to educate policymakers all the time.
Yeah. Well, you've probably answered my next point, Magnus, with that. Are emissions targets and environmental policies being set with a real grasp of how fishing actually operate?
Sometimes. I mean, so what Duncan's been talking about here are exactly the sort of things that the industry can do. They are minor amendments, minor changes. When last time, after the spike in prices, the government came out with an engine replacement scheme for fishermen, and great idea. It'd be great if we could swap for boats where it's appropriate, where we could swap over to like hybrid system or electric system or something, and there was money available. But the trouble is that fishermen had to pay out to do it, and the cost, I can't remember what the cost is for a brand new electric propulsion system, but it's a significant amount of money to a small boat operator, and it's also a problem when when I go into a room full of skippers. I'm a young man, Jim. There's sort of a lot of skippers that are in their late 50s, early 60s, and they're looking and being told, well, it'll cost you £30,000 or £40,000 for a new propulsion system. And they're thinking, well, I'm going to be out of this in 5 years' time,
Yeah,
so, why bother, So what I would like to see from government is, in terms of policies, is to recognise that these small wins are worthwhile and to help fund those small changes that fishermen make, such as fuel motors and eco motors and prop paint and all the other minor changes that you can do, and it's something that's in the wheelhouse that's telling fishermen how much fuel they're using per hour, so, or a mile or whatever. So I think I would love to see that come from government, and that would be a real step forward. Duncan? Yeah.
If I just sort of come in on that a little bit, there was that engine replacement scheme that you're talking about, and it had an option for sort of hybrids or battery propulsion systems, and it was quite a good offer. But I think the people that it was targeted at didn't know about it, didn't understand how to go about getting it, and didn't understand what would be suitable for their vessel. And that was kind of part of the challenge. And the hybrid bit was maybe a little early, but on the sort of very often for government funding, it seems to be very difficult to get. We've done a couple of projects in Norway in aquaculture, and they had a very, very simple way of promoting electrification, which was for every kilowatt of battery you had on board, you got a certain amount of Nockies back from the government. And that amount was more than what the batteries cost. So there was a big incentive to guys when they were building boats to put on the biggest battery possible, because actually it helped to fund other bits on board their boat. And that's meant that now Norway has a huge hybrid fleet, and that's a big reduction in their fuel use, especially in aquaculture, but also I think some of their fishing vessels. And from what we saw of that was like one form sent to government, a couple of receipts, and then they just got money. Where I know some people that have done the engine replacement scheme, and it was a lot of letters and application forms, and it worked well. They got their money, but it just seemed hard work for them.
They're very complex. UK application systems, the DEFRA system is. I mean, I work in a university, and if I mention DEFRA to I have a whole, not me personally, but the university has a whole office of people who are involved in funding applications. When I mention DEFRA, they run away and hide, because the application system is so difficult. But something else, Duncan, I think this is a conversation we've had previously, Duncan, but I think one of the needs could be for fishermen to have access to people like Duncan around the country. So when they want to make a change in their propulsion system, they can go and get some good advice. Somebody that can say, right, for your boat in that situation, the thing that you're doing, these are the options that you could think about. And like a clinic, so a skipper could go to a clinic, a fuel reduction clinic, with somebody that knows what they're talking about, and just get some, because it's every boat's different, isn't it? Every skipper's different, every use of the boat is different, and they need different advice for different circumstances. And that would be one thing that government could do, which would be a massive step forward. That would be a really good thing.
It's one of the things, especially with electrification and fitting batteries, is you can't have the same level of spare capacity that you do with diesel. You can fit a tank that does you a week, 2 weeks on some of these small boats, but you just can't fit a battery that size. It's got to be more suited to the exact operation you're going to do. So that level of advice needs to be a little bit more detailed than it does for a diesel boat.
I have to say, guys, that one of the things that really heartens me is in recent recordings, as I said, with the people from Ecomotus and the people from Assured Marine, listening to Duncan today. I think it's brilliant, Magnus, that there's that minds still around, and the industry has access to them. Clever people, and I think it's so refreshing to know that there is clever guys like that.
So you're not including me there.
Oh,
I was going to say, what about Magnus?
you,
He's a nice, clever chap.
you're in a university. You're excluded. No, I mean hands-on people actually in the industry.
Yeah.
You
There's some
know,
real talent. There is talent around, and we should be nurturing it and looking after it.
yeah, absolutely. I think
But
it's
where I might push back at you here, Jim, is a lot of the smartest people I meet are out there working on fishing boats. They're not academically smart necessarily like Magnus, but their understanding and their intuition for what their boat does, what it needs, how it's moving, is incredible. And everyone brings something different to the table. Um, it happens that I understand how to draw boats and a little bit of how the resistance and stability works around that, but it's a collective from everyone in the industry.
I'm not sure that I appreciated that, Duncan. You trying to get one over on me with Magnus.
Ganging up on you.
When you say that earlier, Magnus, and well, maybe Duncan would answer this. You just alluded on it. Are there particular types of vessel where these technologies are more effective?
So, in terms of the sort of list I had earlier of things you can change on your boat, they'll work for all vessels to
Okay.
some extent, depending on where your baseline is. A lot of the time, actually, the bigger vessels with more fuel consumption will see the benefit quicker. In terms of the cost, is probably a smaller proportion of what their fuel bill is. So that saving will be made in a shorter time frame. Their sort of return on investment. Um, but when you look forward to that sort of electrification side of things, it really suits the smaller vessels with a low power profile and short operation. And certainly, it's a big investment to make that change. And I do think that there probably will be pots of money that people can tap into for that to help with it. But that will make a big difference to the day to day cost of running a boat.
Indeed. If a skipper invests in a system, can it genuinely improve the economics of their trip?
So I would say yes. In a lot of cases, if you invest in a lot of these systems that make the boat more efficient, it's going to make you use less fuel, and that's going to save you money on a trip basis. One of the things that I would maybe just gently warn about, especially in that maybe looking slightly further ahead, is there will be technologies that will get outdated quite quickly or will be proved not to be the best choice. So if you install a certain battery system, there's a chance that the charging, powering, or voltage or something will change in your area, and then you'll be left with struggling to figure out a good way around that. Or a pretty good example from a sort of opposite industry is the relatively recent news about Aberdeen's hydrogen bus fleet that they invested in 2021. Um, and effectively, they don't have a hydrogen supply for it, and the buses have been sitting not working. So they bought something, but the supply to run it isn't there. And actually, they're making a full pivot towards doing battery electric for those buses, um, which I thought was quite interesting in terms of that risk is something that you can survive as a bus company, especially. I think there's probably some backing from council towards that. But if you're an individual operator, owner of a fishing boat, if you invest in the wrong technology and it becomes outdated, that's your full livelihood on the line, and that's a real concern. So trying to find good, mature solutions that maybe also there's a door to step back through. Coating your propeller, there's a door to step back through. You can scrape that off if it didn't work and it made it worse. Obviously, that's not the case from what we've been hearing, and the same with the ecomotive system. If it didn't work, if it didn't make your engine more efficient, if it actually made you burn more fuel, which I'm not in any way suggesting it does, you can take it off. It's not such a high value item that loss would necessarily put you out of business. But if you ripped out your engine and had put in a hydrogen tank and a fuel cell, and then there's no hydrogen supply, that's very scary to your business.
I think we're at the stage, and we see this in other areas, and you'll have seen this yourself, Jim, in your long career. We're at that stage where it's early adopters that are taking up technology and they're trying it out. And these are the madmen like Hans Uncles, who's fearless in his approach. He's absolutely gone for it, and it's cost him, and he's really gone in for this electric boat. But not everyone can do that, and not everyone wants to do that. And it takes these people, these sort of people at the cutting edge, really to have a go first, and then other people will follow along behind. And that's been historic in fisheries, I think, from going from sail over to steam, or using sounders, or changing nets, or using, the development of the otter trawl, and people have changed things over time. But those early adopters are critical in the development of the industry. And with this decarbonisation drive, it's going to be the same. It's the same thing. The early adopters are the people leading the way, and what we need to do is support them better. So I mean, I would like to see people that are willing to give something a go, having an open hand from government, saying, "Okay, we know it's a risk. We're not 100% sure it's going to work, but we're going to support you and let you have a go, because we recognise the fact that if this works, then we're going to see." So imagine, say my wonderful idea of this My Boat's data thing works, and it saves even 10% of the fuel costs for an individual skipper, or even 5%. And you do the sums and look at how much fuel we're using per day around the UK, just in the small boat sector. I did it myself a while ago, and I'm not even going to tell you the number because I couldn't believe it. I had to go away and do the sums again. If we could save 5-10% of fuel use using ecomotors, propeller coatings, driving more slowly, changing behaviour, not switching the engine off when you come aside, all those things. If we could save even it's a massive, massive amount of fuel and money that the country or the industry as a whole would be saving. And I would like to see government finding ways, encouraging people to try things out and adopt things, because there's partly because the government has to be the people that do this, because there is no single solution, so we need people to be trying out different things, and for people like Duncan and me and other skippers to learn from that. And so, right, in that situation, this works. In that situation, that doesn't work, but this might work, and so the industry needs support to develop these myriad of different solutions there are to all the different ways that we work. I mean, you can look around the country, just as an example. If you look around the country and look at boat designs, if you look at cobbles in my part of the world, they're completely different to a Shetland model. And that's for good reason. That's because fishermen have evolved a method that works in that part, for the things they want to do and the things. So it's going to be the same with these adaptations to reducing carbon cost. It's going to be that there are different solutions for different ports, different methods, different boats, different sizes of boats, different, and it's not a simple single solution. That's why we need external support in order to develop them.
When you're saying that, Magnus, I feel you can correct me, Duncan, but that's what I see in Stephen. He seems to be a kind of guy that's willing to have a go. He's willing to invest. And he's not frightened of the dreaded word change. And he's certainly very positive that this is saving him a lot of money. So, but it'd be interesting to hear more from Duncan on the long-term success of that in the future, definitely.
I agree.
So technology can help, Duncan, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. The pressures of fishermen remain very real, and the question becomes, how does the fleet adapt to survive in today's conditions?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question. There's no specific answer to it
No, I know that. Yeah,
because it's going to look so different for all the different boats. What the best way for them to move forward and survive is. But talking in general, as we've sort of bashed on about in this conversation, is the best ways to save fuel, the most economic ways to save fuel on board your vessel is going to be key in that. And then the other thing is unlocking the maximum price you can get for your product. And that's how we've got to move to adapt. And this is actually where I've got a suggestion for you. Is have you ever spoken to anyone from the Icelandic Ocean Cluster and their 100% fish initiative?
no,
So I'm going to butcher this, and I would really recommend you get someone from that on to talk about it. But they
okay,
looked at how to improve the value that they get out of the fish, and that's down to lots of different businesses working together to see what they could do with what's the byproduct of the fish. And in doing that, they greatly increase the value that they get for every fish caught. There's some of the fish skin is used in medicine or bandages.
yeah,
There's companies using the fish bones to make toys for kids and a huge variety of things. But all of that adds up to give them an increased value for the fish. And I think you would have a great conversation with someone from that, and it would be worthwhile hearing. I think I've seen something about there being a Scottish ocean cluster that's trying to follow a similar idea, but I haven't read enough about that to really have any information. But that is the two parts: the how do we get more money for fish, and how do we spend less money on fuel catching it.
I couldn't agree with you more, Duncan. And I would definitely like to get in touch with that people. I know I have good friends in Iceland, spoke to a lot. But when you're saying that about the use of that is one of the things that was in my mind earlier when I was suggesting that we get the shore side in the room, because it's just shocking the percentage of fish in this country that end up in the offal bin. And exactly when you say to look at what the Icelanders are doing as far as oil with the liver, and there's so many things. One of my favorite cuts of fish is the belly flap. And it's cut off and it goes into the bin. And I try to do a lot of that when I had my own restaurant in Scrabster. One of the most, and it was very, very popular, monkfish liver. Now it's a absolute delicacy in Japan, worth a fortune. Ours is when the fish is gutted, it goes back over the side. So I couldn't agree with you more there, Duncan. We have a long, long way to go in getting more out the fish. And what I said earlier, keep more. Don't put the small haddock in the bait box. Get it on the slab. Get it in the fishmonger's shop. Get it in the fish and chip shops. We're importing 95% of the fish that our fryers use comes from Norway and Iceland, and we're putting perfect fish for a fryer giving it to the lobsters as bait. I couldn't agree with that more, Duncan. And I would love to speak to that people.
Yeah, it was at a fisheries innovation and sustainability event that I heard about it. So I think you've spoken to Cara before, but she would be able to connect you.
Excellent. Do you agree with that, Magnus?
Absolutely. I think it's interesting because normally when we talk about increasing the value of fish, we mean people like Chris Bean, skipper on the south coast, and he used to have his own during the summer. So he's in Cornwall, Devon sort of area. So it's quite a big touristy area. So in the summer, there's lots of people around that want to buy fresh, locally caught fish, and they're in the mood to experiment. And that's normally what we think about when we talk about increasing the value of fish. It's having short supply chains, selling direct from the skipper to the consumer. But what Duncan's talking about, which is maximizing the use of, yes, we need to get people to eat more than just cod and haddock. We need to get people eating the whole diversity of fish. But the other solution is to make more of the commercial species that come in bulk. Pollock, cod, haddock, plaice, saithe, all these things, and get the most out of them. And I think that's absolutely using technology and research to get the use out of things. Even things like nephrops. I know that Whitby Seafoods have been looking a lot at finding ways to use the shells, the exoskeletons of nephrops for other things. The guys that are doing the clawbinder research, they're looking at ways of can they use things that are biodegradable things sourced from fish to make the things they want to make in order to bind claws. So there's definitely technology and research got a big role to play in trying to maximize the value that fishermen get for their catch. But we need to make sure it's passed on, so that value is passed on to the fishermen. They're not just getting paid for what gets consumed as a prime fillet. I don't know how you do that.
When I had the restaurant and I was doing this monkfish livers, we had Japanese people using the restaurant a lot. They were really good customers. They were in a joint venture up here in a battery factory with UK. The company's still going, an important employer in Caithness here. And they were good customers. And they asked me, they were coming a lot, wanting oysters, and they were just brilliant. And they came to me then and they said, look, we're loving this. We want you to do some sashimi for us. And I says to them, look, I says, I'll be perfect. I'll be 100% upfront with you. I says, we're a small business, small family business, my wife and I and a small staff. I says, I would love to do sashimi. I says, but I says, my problem, what I feel is you guys have access to the best sushi and sashimi, central London, Tokyo, absolute best top restaurants. I says, you're important customers of mine. I don't want to upset you and make a mistake or do it wrong and maybe lose your business. And the wee guy come up and he put his hand on my shoulder, and Jim, in his broken Japanese, he says to me, don't you forget, he says, the best sashimi is not how close you are to Tokyo, central Tokyo or London. He said, it's right here where we can get the freshest fish. I just thought, wow, it was, and that was cheeks, cod and the tongues and the cheeks of the monkfish. Just what Duncan said earlier, just about using, I was using the jaw. I was cutting out the jaws of the monkfish and using them. And if somebody asked me about it, I would say, "Oh, do you like a chicken wing?" Oh yeah, I like a chicken wing. I says, "Well, there's your chicken wing of the sea."
That's brilliant. Excellent.
So yeah, definitely, I'm just all on that one. Are smaller inshore boats more at risk, do you feel?
I think we could both answer that in slightly different ways. So, I think that they are in some ways, and that's because they're not as efficient as these great big boats. There's what people call industrial fishing, but they're really important to local communities. I mean, locally, their value to the economy is phenomenal. The Bridlington is built on the backs of fishermen, and not many of the boats are that much more than 10 meters, and they're vulnerable. The boats in the Clyde, these middle scale trawlers that work in the Clyde, they're vulnerable to especially these kind of oil price shocks. So they're all trawling boats, and if we lose them, we lose a massive part of our culture as much as anything else. And I think I've heard it quoted on this show several times. One local fisherman at sea employs between 7 and 15 people ashore. So these little boats that work in small ports around the coast are really valuable. But yes, they're threatened. They cannot be as efficient as a big offshore boat. If you look at the carbon efficiency of an offshore trawler or seine netter, their carbon efficiency is 10 times better than a small inshore boat, but they don't offer the same value in terms of how they support local communities. I mean, I don't think.
I think I'd have a lot of agreement with Magnus there. I think the one thing is on the sort of smaller, especially static gear boats, is as we look forward towards the sort of move away from fossil fuels, they've got a relatively certain direction that they're going to go, which is towards electrification for most of them, and having batteries on board. And that's actually it's hard for them right now, but I can quite easily see how they continue the same sort of operation. Boats Magnus was talking about on the Clyde, sort of small, mid-sized trawlers, they are very vulnerable to this, and also very vulnerable to what happens in the future for that type of boat, because they're not an easy problem to solve in a net zero world. And I think that's one of the challenges. I think as someone who designs boats and wants fishermen to be safe, my biggest concern whenever I hear about fuel price spikes for small boats is that maybe a boat that's normally 2 or 3 crew will decide to go out short-handed or single-handed and greatly increase the risk profile to the fishermen at sea. And that really worries me. And it's a difficult problem, but obviously if your fuel cost goes up, if you can reduce your crew cost, then you keep your business running. But I'd really advise anyone thinking about doing that to really consider the risks fully and take that on board. I think also, as we mentioned earlier, small boats, the cost of some of the changes, that an ecomotive system isn't going to be really any cheaper for an 8-meter boat than it will be for a 24-meter boat. But the savings of the 24-meter boat will be much more significant. And that sort of level of being able to invest to reduce is much harder for small boats.
I think one of the interesting things with this increase in fuel price for the small boat sectors, I was talking to Sarah Reddy a while back, who lives in Brixham, and they're a fishing family. They've got, I think it's called the Two Brothers, their boat, and they she had this expression that you won't know if you don't go. and so fishermen are used to that. If you want to find some new ground to fish, or you've got to invest and go an extra 100 miles or 50 miles or something like that. When the fuel price spikes like this, you can no longer do that. And what that means is, and what that meant last time, was that boats were all fishing closer to home. So those local grounds were the grounds that were being used up more quickly, because the fishermen couldn't afford to go out and travel further in order to catch stuff, and that's something we need to be aware of, I think.
When I said earlier, when the value of fish, and I mentioned that my mother used to always say to us, if a man was lost, boat was lost, anything at sea, they would say, that's the price of fish. That's the real, or the true price of fish. Are we valuing fish properly today?
No. So hard. Because my mother-in-law bought me some sardines for Christmas, and there were these beautiful fish caught off the south coast. They're tinned sardines, and I ate them, and I thought, these are amazing. They're like very different to your 60p tin of sardines that you get from Tesco's. And I thought, I'll get some more of these, and I looked them up, and they're £10 a tin, and that's the value. That's what they're worth, though. These, I mean, they were amazing, beautiful fish to eat. Now I can afford to. I won't do it very often, but I can afford to spend £10 for a treat for myself. But I want fish to be available to people that don't live. I want people at the other end of, that aren't on a big salary, to be able to afford to eat fish that's caught locally as well. So those 60p tins of sardines in Tesco's, or the Cornish sardine, £1.20 for a tin of sardines in Cornish, decent quality Cornish sardines. So, do we value fish? Saying that's like, do we value cars? At the one end of the spectrum, we've got the sort of car that I drive, and at the other end of the spectrum, we've got the sort of car that you drive, Jim. I'm no doubt it's a Jaguar or something like that. Mine's a cheap. mine's a cheap car. So, I mean, different fish should be valued. Sorry, different fish should be valued in different ways. A lobster is valued at Christmas. A lobster is valued at £40 a kilo. And that's to a market that'll buy it, but they happen to be Italians and French and Spanish. Whereas a crab, which in my book is a better eat sometimes, it doesn't attract the same amount of money. So I don't know if there's an easy answer to that question, to tell you the truth. And
I think there's an easy answer to the point you made about my car. I can hear fishermen all over Scotland laughing when they hear that, because what I always say to anybody, you have to consider, if you're driving a vehicle of mine, there's one thing you can't afford to have: an ego. Magnus, I have a 17-plate van out at the door just now. That's the vehicle I drive in. And if I was to be perfectly honest about it and tell you why, yes, back in the days, I've had the Beamers, the Mercs, them all. I don't say it with any pride, but they smell the fish the same way as my van does today. And I think, what's the point?
Yes. Yeah. And my wife would say that's why I've got a cheap car, because I can't keep them clean. So.
No. My limit, my budget for changing my vehicle was £500. So you got that one wrong, my friend. So, and go back to that. do we reduce it just another commodity, ignoring what it actually takes to catch it, with the value of fish?
Well, I think there's an education job, and there has been for years. We need to educate people about what the industry is and about everything. But you can say it's for the whole food industry, by the way. So people need to appreciate all the effort that goes in by food producers to make that thing that ends up in a packet in Tesco's, or a tin in Tesco's or Sainsbury's or Marks and Spencer's. They need to appreciate that how much work goes into that, and I think sometimes people don't. But lots of people do. Lots of people that are interested in food, the sort of people that would go to your restaurants, Jim, that appreciate good food, will appreciate the effort. But it's up to people like you and me and other people in the food industry to keep telling people, educate people about the value of what it takes to get that fillet on your plate in front of you.
When you're saying that, both, yeah, I remember a really close friend who was almost going to come in business with. We're going to have a joint venture ourselves with fish at the time. I'm going back to the 80s to mid-90s. And unfortunately, he passed away very young. Didn't actually happen, but I thought what foresight he had. And he looking at the industry at large, he says, you've got it wrong. He says, you've got it wrong. Your product. He said, it shouldn't be stack them high and sell them cheap in a supermarket. He says, they should be sold in delicatessens.
I agree. Yeah. But you want other people, but you want people that can't afford to go to a delicatessen to eat our fish as well.
One of the issues I have every time I go shopping in the local shops here, so Banff and Macduff, which is where there's a lot of fishing going on, is all the fish in the supermarkets is not from the UK. It's foreign. I try to go to the local fishmonger whenever I can, but if you end up in Tesco's, I don't have a choice to buy anything from the UK a lot of the time, which is, I think, probably a big problem when you start talking about the value and getting into economics and supply and demand, is that there's a lot of supply from elsewhere that's coming in and flooding that market, and that lowers the price.
And did you look over your shoulder before you bought the fish in Tesco's? Going back, Duncan, is it too much focus being put on new technology and not enough on how boats are operated? Or do you feel technology is the future?
So how boats are operated is probably one of the key things as to making an efficient industry. But lots of boats are already efficiently operated with people very good. And the only way to improve it further then becomes technology. In discussions I've had previously with someone in aquaculture who knows about a hybrid boat that went into service, it was actually using more fuel than the equivalent diesel vessel was before, because the guys running the boat weren't running it efficiently. So you can't out technology a personnel problem. But equally, we can't magically operate the boats more efficiently than where their limits are.
If it continues the way it is, are we simply heading for a smaller fleet?
Well, we're already heading that way, aren't we? We've already lost a lot of especially smaller boats around the coast, and that might be partly. Again, it's not just driven by just fuel prices, by the fact the boats are more efficient, or can catch more now, and maybe. And there's a sort of management impositions as well, and one of the I really believe that management has a real role to play here. That the fact that we kind of fishermen end up forced into being this kind of fisherman that's either you're a potter or you're a trawler or you're a netter or you're and you cannot fish for what is there at the time. So if you're in Brid and there's a pulse of mackerel comes through or a pulse of pilchards comes through or something like that, then or sardines or bait fish or something, you can't go for them because you don't have the quota or the ability to use a particular set of gear. I think you had Bryce Stewart talking about octopus recently and I listened to somebody talking about that from the Devon IFCA, and she gave a really excellent presentation, and so that was a case where there was a bloom of octopus, and the fishermen could go for it because it was there. Some of them, not all of them could, but some of them could, and they were able to benefit from that. If that had been bass, right, they wouldn't have been able to go for it, not because the bass weren't there, but because they didn't have the right quota, and the management would not have been able to move quickly enough to say, right, there's a sort of abundance of a new species on the ground here. Let's let fishermen go and fish for it. So one of the things we need to do is to loosen up management somehow, find ways to let fishermen fish for what's there, rather than sort of forcing them to always fish for one or two species because that's what they've got the quota for, or that's what they've got the gear for, or and hopefully technology in management will allow for fisheries managers to improve the speed at which they can respond to those changes that are coming. It's all links together. It's all tied together.
I would say, yes, I agree with you, Magnus, but I thought, what a solution, what a great mind, and you know the guy very well. And Michael Kaiser, and talking to him one day, it's in a podcast, sorry, and as he says, and I thought, gee, that's really clever. He says, the industry needs to take control of the policing, of the, quota management, the whole thing. The industry needs to take control. And I thought, how true is that? How far-sighted is that?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I mean, they need to be doing more research themselves. They need to be doing more of the science, because I think in doing that, they become more responsible. If they understand what's going on their own grounds with their own species, that makes them more aware that they are responsible for managing their own grounds.
Yeah. Would you say, could any practical change make a difference to fishermen just now, Duncan? Is there anything that is advanced enough?
I mean, I think a lot of the things that we've discussed today can all make a practical change to fishermen. My real advice to fishermen would be to be proactive about doing things, investigate their options, think about what they can do, invest their money wisely in things that save them fuel or save them other costs, and to make sure that they don't just say fuel price is high and then bury their head in the sand. Try really hard to challenge, see where they can improve, try and really push for that. Like Magnus was saying, when there's other species coming through, if they had the ability to go and fish for them, knowing fishermen, they would be very quickly at that. They'd come up with really innovative ways to swap their boats around to suit that. I'd really challenge fishermen to try and take that same mentality that they'd have for catching more fish to saving more fuel.
You could tell me if you think this is, it's just thinking back as you've been, some of the things you've been saying. I can remember, a number of years back, probably 70s and 80s and that, we used to get a heap of boats coming into Scrabster. I would be on board them down talking to them. They were into Scrabster to wait for the tide before they would go through the Firth. Just say there were East Coast, mostly East Coast boats fishing west, and they would be going through the Firth, either going home or to get a refit or paint up or that, and they would come into Scrabster for a few hours, wait for the tide. I never see that now. Now, I always put it down to there's less boats now, but they're much more powerful. I'm talking maybe 100 horsepower engines, 150 gardeners, that sort of thing. And I just thought it was always down to size of the engine, and they're much, much more powerful now. And so do you feel with adapting to things like that, do you think there would be savings in fuel doing that, what they used to do?
Yeah, hugely. I mean, coming through the Pentland Firth is something like 10 to 12 knots at full flow. If you're going against that in a lot of boats, you're at full revs and not really making any progress.
Yeah.
But if you're going the other way, you can be almost knocked entirely off and going faster than you've ever gone over the ground. So, that decision makes sense from a fuel perspective. The big question is, does it make sense from a crew perspective? And at what point do those costs make it a bad idea? If you're having to steam down and let guys off the boat when you get back to Fraserburgh, does getting there 4 hours earlier save you a lot in terms of your either cost for crew or also gain you goodwill from the crew versus them hanging about in Scrabster waiting for the tide? There's a real balance in all of that between cost and maybe non-monetary cost, if you understand.
Mm-hmm. This is a pretty obvious point I was going to ask. I think Magnus already mentioned that they come up with it as the fuel price stays the same or even goes higher. What does the UK fishing fleet look like in 10 years' time?
I don't know is the honest answer. I think, as Magnus said,
I don't want to know.
Probably smaller, but as I mentioned earlier, the fishermen are some of the smartest guys I've ever seen. They know their boats. They're resilient. They're resourceful, and they're very good at sort of ingenuity. And I believe that lots of them will find a solution to the problem that will allow them to continue working as fishermen. I don't think any of them do this as a job like some other people. It's a career, it's a lifestyle. Nobody leaves being a fisherman easily. I'd listened to your podcast the other day. I'm trying to remember the name of the skipper who'd left to have his MOT business and garage.
Oh,
But
Mike
Ballinger was still there for him. Yeah. And that's what I see from fishermen all the time, that they are fishermen, even if they've had to leave their boat to go and do a different job. That's still how they'd characterise themselves. And I'm sure they'll find a way back if they've got to leave, or they'll find a way to make it through.
Yeah. I remember a fisherman told me, do you know how to make £1 million in fishing, Jim? You start with 2 million. There's a lot of guys do it because it's a passion, it's a way of life, and all the rest of it. But I think there are quite a few at the moment. Certainly in Bridlington, I speak to people on the quay there. They'd happily, if there was a decommissioning scheme tomorrow, they'd take it. They'd go.
Yeah,
because it's just hard. It's so hard. It was hard before this fuel spike, so I worry about if this lasts too long about what they're going to do.
I mean, I think that's maybe touching on something you said earlier as well. Is that the age of skippers is always increasing, and a lot of them are at that retirement age. But if fuel price is high and fishing isn't attractive, they won't get money back out of their boat when they try to sell, and that's potentially a really difficult situation for a lot of people. Unfortunately, I don't really have a solution, but if there was some sort of decommissioning scheme, I could see that being attractive for a lot of people before they're left with a stranded asset and struggling to make ends meet.
Indeed. Tell me, where can our listeners follow you online? Have you a social media presence?
I personally don't have much of a social media presence at all. I've got a LinkedIn page, but I'm not very active on it. The company, however, has both a LinkedIn and a Facebook, and we put stuff up there quite regularly. And if you want to speak to me about anything that's been in the podcast today, I'm really happy for people to message me on LinkedIn or message the company, and that'll come through to me as well. So
excellent.
Same here. So I'm on LinkedIn and Blue Sky, so I can be found there, or through the University of Hull. Very happy to I steal ideas from fishermen, and so I'm a bit of a magpie for words of wisdom from skippers that I can then turn into research or ideas or to try and help the industry, obviously.
Excellent. I think we've maybe followed up. It's clear from this conversation that the challenges facing the fishing industry aren't just technical, they're economical, structural, and very real for the people living it every day. But if one thing stands out, it's this: no matter what changes are talked about, it all still comes out of the cod end. And maybe we should all think a bit harder about that. What the true price of fish really is. Magnus and Duncan, thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim. It's been a pleasure, as always.
it's been lovely to talk to you both. Thanks.
Thank you very much.